We begin in 1199 with the monarch, who set a new standard for royal incompetence. King John got to understand just how badly John failed. You first have to understand medieval Europe, where a king's main responsibilities were defending his territories, keeping the peace, and avoiding conflict with every powerful nobleman who owned a sword. John managed to fail at all three after taking the throne following the death of his famous brother. Richard the Lionheart, John quickly lost Normandy, the huge ancestral homeland of the English royal family in France. This earned him the nickname John Softsword, desperate to recover his lost lands. John squeezed the nobility with heavy taxes, kidnapped the families of lords who could not pay, and had political rivals locked away in dark dungeons. He also picked a fight with the Pope, which resulted in England being placed under an interdict. For 6 years, almost nobody in England could legally be married, baptized, or buried through the church by 1215. John's barons had become so fed up that they forced him to sign the Magna Carta, a revolutionary document designed to place limits on royal authority. John signed it, then immediately broke his promises, invited a French invasion, and ended his reign by accidentally losing his royal baggage train, including a huge amount of gold, in a muddy swamp. He then died from dysentery. Moving forward to 1307, we meet another example of terrible royal management, King Edward II. Edward inherited a kingdom that was already fighting Scotland from his intimidating father, Edward I, but the young king was far less interested in ruling the country than in giving enormous power to his favorite courtier, a knight named Piers Gaveston. In medieval politics, a king who governed through one favorite meant everyone else was effectively pushed out of the decision-making process. Edward gave Gaveston titles, wealth, and political power, which made the English nobility furious. Their anger became so intense that they eventually kidnapped and executed him. But Edward learned nothing from it. Instead, he found another set of favorites, the corrupt father and son pair, Hugh Despenser Sr. and Hugh Despenser Jr. While Edward was busy giving power to his favorites, the Scottish King Robert the Bruce destroyed the English army at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, securing Scotland's independence. By the 1320s, England was falling apart under famine and repeated military failures. The final crisis came when Edward's own wife, Queen Isabella, traveled to France, joined forces with an exiled nobleman named Roger Mortimer, and invaded England with a mercenary army. The English population had become so tired of Edward's rule that almost nobody was willing to fight for him. Parliament removed him from power, forcing him to give up the throne. He died soon afterward under highly suspicious circumstances at Berkeley Castle. Moving into the late 14th century, we meet King Richard II, who became king in 1377, when he was only 10 years old, growing up as a boy king surrounded by uncles who were constantly involved in political plots. Gave Richard a serious case of paranoia and an enormous ego. This was the period of the Black Death and the Peasants' Revolt. Europe was going through major social unrest, and ordinary people were beginning to question the authority of the feudal system. Instead of responding with careful leadership, Richard began acting as if he were personally chosen by God to rule everyone. He demanded that people address him as Your Majesty, and required courtiers to kneel silently whenever he appeared. By the 1390s, his rule had turned into outright autocracy, which is a political system where one ruler holds unchecked power without laws or rivals strong enough to stop them. Richard created his own private army, executed or exiled political opponents, and took away the legal charters of towns. His final mistake came in 1399 after his uncle, the extremely wealthy John of Gaunt, died. Richard seized John's enormous Lancastrian inheritance for himself, leaving John's exiled son, Henry Bolingbroke, with nothing. Henry returned to England with an army to reclaim his inheritance. The nobility quickly joined his side, and Richard was soon removed from the throne. The king was imprisoned at Pontefract Castle, where he was quietly starved to death. That family conflict eventually came back in 1422 with King Henry VI, a man who inherited the crowns of both England and France while he was still a baby. On paper, Henry seemed almost perfect. He was deeply religious, disliked violence, valued education, and founded famous institutions such as Eton College. But being gentle was a serious weakness for a medieval king. England was fighting France in the 100 Years' War, and the country needed a strong military leader. Instead, Henry was passive, easily controlled by bad advisors, and almost incapable of making decisions. Under his weak leadership, English forces lost nearly all their French territories, leaving England financially ruined and humiliated. Then in 1453, the shock of losing France caused Henry to suffer a complete mental breakdown. He entered a catatonic state that lasted for more than a year, during which he could not speak or walk, with the king unable to rule. Rival noble families began fighting for control. The House of Lancaster and the House of York turned against each other, beginning the bloody civil conflict known as the Wars of the Roses. Henry became little more than a human chess piece. He was captured, restored to the throne, removed again, and eventually murdered in the Tower of London. Finally, we reached the 17th century and King Charles I, who became king in 1625. By this point, Europe was moving away from medieval feudalism, and parliaments had become increasingly important for collecting taxes and representing wealthy merchants. Charles, however, strongly believed in the divine right of kings. This was the idea that monarchs were chosen directly by God and answered only to God, rather than being subject to human laws. When Parliament refused to give Charles enough money for his poorly planned foreign wars, he simply dissolved Parliament and ruled without it for 11 years. He raised money through strange and outdated tax loopholes and attempted to impose religious changes on Scotland. The Scots responded with a rebellion, needing money to fight the war. Charles was forced to call Parliament back, but when Parliament demanded political reforms, Charles made an astonishing decision. He entered the House of Commons with armed guards in an attempt to arrest his critics. That direct attack on Parliament helped trigger the English Civil War. After years of fighting, Charles was defeated by the forces of Oliver Cromwell. Even while in prison, Charles secretly worked to start a second civil war. Parliament eventually put the king on trial for treason against his own people. He was found guilty. Then, on a freezing day in January 1649, Charles I was taken onto a scaffold in London and publicly beheaded.